Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jon Meyer, and I'm going to get us started for all of you who showed up on time. As a reminder, as I get started, in your panel, there is a Q&A button. If you do have questions as we go along today, feel free to ask them whenever you want, and I'll try to jump on them. I'll be watching them off to my right-hand side here, so feel free to do that. Today, we're going to talk a bit about how to gear up for retirement from the perspective of how to think about this 10 years out, 5 years out, 1 year out. And then I'll have a couple slides on, okay, the year you're retiring. So as I get into this, I want to remind everyone that the scenarios I'm going to talk about are uh, not generally meant for specific people individually. So please seek out any kind of professional assistance, whether it be us or someone else, of course, because there are going to be plenty of things I'm going to bring up that I want people to make sure they get one-on-one assistance with. Some of this stuff gets a little esoteric. To that extent, I want to remind you that BGM as a whole has a lot of services available. If you've been on these calls in the past, all this stuff on the bottom here plays out in different points in your life. Most recent one we've added as an example is this boutique M&A, where if you're a business owner, we can help you sell your business now. So just a heads up. With that, I want to get started on today's agenda. Today's agenda is going to be based on a timeline. And so I'm going to focus on what to do to prepare for retirement. Sometimes I'm going to get into some things that are kind of general in nature. I'll try to make sure you understand why the specifics of something's important. And then as we go along, I will kind of narrow it down from 10 years, 5 years, 1 year, that you start to understand a little bit more about how these things go from a big funnel on down into a very small funnel. Keep in mind when you read about retirement planning on the internet, especially with AI these days, there's tons and tons of information, but it's that funnel of, okay, there's all of this, what actually applies to me? I think that's the hardest part about it. And I'm actually in the industry, so there you go. So let's start with the idea of how do we start building the foundation 10 years out? What are some of the things we need to start thinking about? What I want to really start focusing on 10 years out is a basic concept of where is your money? This isn't a question of how much money you have. Um, those things come into play, but it's more where is it? What people need to start thinking about when they're further out from retirement is saving is easy, but the distribution side of retirement planning is the hard part. And when you get to retirement age and you say, okay, now I want to get my money out, it's too late to suddenly say, oh, I wish I would have done something different. So you really got to start with thinking about this 10 years out. And if I had my druthers, you'd be thinking about this 20 years out or 30 years out, to be honest with you. Because at the end of the day, most people get to retirement with all their money in 401k and IRA plans. Not enough people get to retirement with other accounts like brokerage accounts, Roth IRAs, HSAs, even cash. And so what we typically see is people getting to retirement with 80 to 100% of their money in 401k and IRAs when they really should have closer to a 50-50 split. Now, if they have 50% in retirement accounts and 50% in brokerage, Roth, HSA side, the beauty of that is as they go into retirement, it's easier for us as professionals to help you from a distribution standpoint and manage your tax brackets. I have clients who, when they have only 401k and IRA accounts, from dollar one, they're paying taxes as they pull money out. I have other clients living on hundreds and hundreds of thousands a year in very low tax brackets because they have a mix. And so we can kind of play with that back and forth to see if we can't get them into the lower brackets, like the 12% bracket or sometimes the 22% bracket. But I'm not going to get into all the details around the tax side. I just want you to, from a mindset standpoint, start looking at where you're at and say, am I where I need to be in this kind of percentage standpoint of how close am I to a 50-50 split? Even if you're at 100% retirement accounts right now and nothing anywhere else, but you're 10 years out, maybe you can get it down to an 80-20 split. Maybe, maybe by sheer luck, because you got to sell a big business or something, you can get it down to a 60-40 split. So what I would say is don't give up on the idea. Keep pushing towards that idea, because I think in the end, that's one of the most fundamental ideas I'm going to give you today is it's going to matter more in retirement when it comes to the distribution side. The second point I want to make, though, is that it's time to ramp up savings as much as you can. Now, ignore the fact that I just told you don't do it all in your 401k and IRA. I wanted to at least give you the limits on this stuff so that you understand that there are opportunities for saving here. 10 years out, most people are still going to be in high tax brackets, probably in your peak earnings years because you're probably in your early 50s. And so, from the standpoint of where you need to be, still getting tax savings and 401ks and stuff makes sense. So, I'm not going to argue against that. As you get closer to retirement, and I'll get into this in a few slides, maybe you can dial it back a little bit. But for now, I just want you to understand that there are some limit numbers that you should be aware of. The newest being this 11,250. That came into play in the tax bills, most recent tax bills that basically are saying from age 60 to 63, there are a higher catch-up limit than the ones for the rest of us. So if you're over age 60, there is some new dollars you can put in that the rest of us don't get. I just bring that up as a suggestion. The other thing to consider now is it's time to think about a budget. But I say that from the standpoint of I kind of sometimes, instead of the word budget, start using the word spending plan, because the reality is very few people budget anymore, but they like to spend. So let's think about it from a spending perspective. How much do you want to spend? So there is a reason to start thinking about what numbers you want. If the monthly spend is, I'll give you a quick formula. If the monthly spend were, let's say, $10,000, and $10,000 a month would be a net number, you want to always kind of think of this as an after-tax number. 10,000 a month times 12 months, that's 120,000 a year. Then you would want to work backwards into that and say that maybe divide by 0.03, 3%, and you get a number that's several $1,000,000. That tells you a little bit about the neighborhood you need to be in if you want to retire comfortably. So I just throw that out as an aside. I'm not going to get into great detail on that, but that is a place to start. The third point I want to make when you're 10 years out is be careful about this discussion of risk. Everyone goes into this idea of retirement with the idea that they have to cut back on their risk. And the reality of that is, for most people, retirement is a date and time, and then past that is another 30 years of living. So the reality is, even if you're 10 years out, you're probably going to live for 40 years yet. And to that extent, I think you got to be really careful about this idea that, oh, I got to start shifting more money into bonds and cash away from equities. Because at the end of the day, that's probably going to hurt you. I'd go so far as to say that for people that stay on a similar risk level, they tend to, over time, because of the smoothing out of returns, they tend to actually have more money that they die with than when they entered retirement with, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. If you think about it, at some level, you're not investing just for your own risk. You're investing probably for your kids or your grandkids' risk, because at the end of the day, you're probably going to give most of your money to them anyways. So from that standpoint, I think being careful about this idea that you got to cut back on risk is a big deal. So when I think about this, when I have clients that look at it and say, well, I can't possibly live with this current risk tolerance, I'll work with them. And what happens is I cut back to kind of that middle ground. So I go from maybe up here down to here, but I never go from up here down to medium or from high down to low. It's going to jeopardize your retirement too much. keep in mind, you got to think about risk and return as return is a gross return, but then you have to subtract fees, taxes, and inflation, and then there's a net number. And it's really that net number you should be focusing on, how much you're actually earning. So if you can actually earn a few percent, 3%, 4% on the high side, probably, after all those things, then all of a sudden it gives you a little bit different feeling than, oh my gosh, I just made 7% in the market. So don't bail on stocks this early. It just doesn't make any sense. The next point I want to make is about debt and the good use of debt. Um, Everyone says debt's bad, but the reality is debt can be okay. And so what we want to think about is anything high interest rate, like typical credit cards and stuff, of course you want to get rid of. But I think in today's market, there's a real question about whether or not you should be paying down mortgages. Um, because for a lot of us, and I don't remember the exact number, but somewhere between, I think it's 60 to 75% of us have a mortgage around 3%. So when you look at it from that angle, do you actually think that you should be paying it down if right now just sitting on cash interest rates are higher than that? So I look at it from that angle a little bit. I used to look at it prior to this where interest rates were at zero and say, well, of course you should pay it down because you're earning nothing on cash. But in this day and age, that's shifted a little bit. So I think the idea of how do we use debt should be back on the table a little bit more than it used to be. People come at me all the time with this question and say, well, I'd feel more comfortable if I could, I could sleep better at night if I don't have a mortgage. That's true. And if that's where you're at, then by all means pay it off. But by and large, what I'll point out is that homes are kind of a dead asset. If you suddenly needed cash, most people aren't going to sell their house to get cash. And so I think there's a new argument to be made for whether or not mortgages get paid off completely. And we are starting to see more and more people actually carrying mortgages into retirement on purpose, not just by default that they can't afford it, but on purpose. So this one aspect I want you to consider. And then finally, on this slide, I want to point out that there are more and more tracking resources out there. There are some on other websites. I mentioned that we at BGM we have a new portal coming out at the end of this year. Some clients are already testing it, and in that you can actually track spending and measure it. It's a pretty cool idea. But the idea there is to allow you to upload credit cards and all that stuff so that you can actually track it and monitor for people that want to. And not everyone's going to want to, but it is a really interesting way of doing this. So I'll point that out as something that you should start thinking about 10 years out. The next step 10 years out before we kind of get through this 10-year period is let's start thinking about Social Security. This isn't really that big of a deal yet, but you really should start thinking about where your benefits are, how long before you start thinking about collecting them, because at different ages, different things happen. So at age 66, 67, that's where a lot of us are going to start taking full benefits. And as we age, by the way, the generation below me, they're not going to be able to get benefits probably before until 70. But for the most part, 66 to 67 is full retirement age. If you take benefits before that, as far back as age 62, you lose 6.5% per year in benefit from this age downwards. If you take benefits out at 70, you gain 8% per year for every year you wait till age 70. Now, when I say that, if you think about it, from 67 to 70, that's 24% higher benefit if you delay that long. A lot of people will say, well, I don't know what I want to do exactly, but there's no reason to delay. The reason to delay, though, is going back to my question about your distribution planning, because this gets into a longer term tax strategy. Going into retirement, if we have the ability to control where things come from so that it's not all coming out of a 401k or an IRA, we actually might want to delay Social Security longer and actually suppress income so that we can do other things in the portfolio, like Roth conversions and things at lower tax brackets. So there are things to consider this far out already as you think about this. And while you don't need to start claiming Social Security, it's good to get a feeling for it. Go on their website, get signed up so that you can log in at any point and get it, because nowadays they do not send you statements anymore. So it's good for you to take a look at it. I'll also point out, when you're on the website, look at your work history, because it's up to you if there's an error in that to let them know where the error occurred. At the end of the day, they're going to look at your last, I think it's roughly 35-year history of work to give you your benefits. So you want to make sure that that's accurate. Moving on, as we think about preparing for healthcare, 10 years out, there isn't as much to do, but the biggest point on here is number two. Too many people have access to health savings accounts and they don't use them, or they use them, what I would say, is in a less efficient manner than they should. So one of the biggest things that happens as you get into retirement is your health needs change. And what we're seeing more and more, everyone says, okay, when I get into retirement, Medicare is going to be bad and I'm going to have to spend all this money. That's actually not true. Medicare is fantastic. And for most people, it's very inexpensive and actually gets you a long way. But you still need to pay for Medicare supplement, and you still have some other issues. And what we see more and more is that for people that want more active healthcare versus just going to the doctor when they're sick, if they want more integrative medicine where they're actually taking a holistic approach, they're going to have to pay cash. So if cash is becoming a bigger player in the healthcare system, then the reality is you need to have a, other types of money laying around, whether it's pure cash or whether it's things like a health savings account, because some of this can still be paid for that way. So what we would prefer people do is maximize their health savings account on an ongoing basis, and then not spend it as they have little trips to the doctor here and there for little things like $100 doctor visit, just pay it out of pocket. Invest that money, let it grow, and 10 years out, 15 years out, 20 years out, as you need money in retirement for health issues, now you've got money that you can spend tax free. The other side to that is, though, save all your receipts, because there is no use it or lose it rule on a health savings account. As long as you have a receipt, you can take it out of the health savings account at any time in the future. And I know people with tens and tens of thousands of dollars in receipts for medical care, prescriptions, all this stuff. Whenever they want, they can just go and drain that account tax free because they still have the medical receipts. And I always joke with people, when you're in your middle retirement years and you want to buy a new boat because the grandkids want one, you could buy a new boat basically tax free. But anyways, that's probably the biggest thing to start thinking about as you get this 10-year out view for health. There are some other things you can start to look into. If you sat in on my longevity webinar, you'll remember that I talked a lot about the intersection of health, wealth, and time. And so this idea of healthy habits, paying cash for certain types of medicine that talks to you more in a holistic perspective versus just when you're sick, things like that, you can start to do more and more of when you're younger. So I would encourage you to be thinking about that. And then as we think about where we should be headed, I can't stress enough that this is the time frame in your early 50s to start having this conversation with your spouse. Too many people go into retirement thinking about it from the perspective of I'm leaving something instead of I'm heading towards something. And so you end up with this dichotomy of I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm leaving my identity behind. And that's a very negative space. So many of us do rely on work for our identities. And I think that's where too many times people get in trouble and they find themselves extremely unhappy as they get into retirement. The time to start having that conversation is 10 years out. You need to start thinking about when things are going to happen. And one of the things, by the way, again, going back to the longevity uh, webinar I did, the intersection of health and wealth, if you think about kind of peak wealth versus peak health, those two lines intersected around age 52. Once you get past that, you start to see people's health continuously decline and their wealth continuously go up. But if you're sick and you can't really spend the money and enjoy it. And so oftentimes what ends up happening 10 years out is people start saying, I'm not going to just pick a date to retire. I'm going to start phasing. And that phased approach allows you to start having more fun doing things you want to do today. Because the reality is you might be able to climb Machu Picchu when you're 58, but you might not be able to climb it when you're 68 or 78. So starting to talk to your spouse about what do we want to accomplish in our future is actually one of the healthiest activities you can do a decade out. And no webinar would be complete if I didn't say hire a guy like us. At the end of the day, you need to start having conversations about things you're not thinking about. And if you have someone that you can bounce ideas off of, you're going to be in a better spot. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about investments, it's about taxes, it's about charity, it's about your estate plan, it's all kinds of things that come into play and they all interact. There's so many times that I see people make short-term decisions with long-term ramifications. They think, oh, this is going to affect me for 6 months, but 20 years later, we're still like, oh, that was a good decision or a bad decision. So I bring this up only because I do think this is the perfect time when you should be hiring yourself an advisor. So if you think about it 10 years out, before I jump into 5 years, 10 years out, you're trying to think through how to retire with um, the most savings in tax deferred accounts, but also other accounts so that you don't get pushed into higher tax brackets. If you think about it from that angle, this is going to drive a lot of the need for the next 5 years roughly until you start to get a little bit closer. But it will definitely drive a different point into the types of savings you're going to do. Now, as we get 5 years out, this is when we have to start refining things a little bit. It can't be quite as broad. We got to start bringing it back down. In this scenario, now you kind of start go back to what I just said and say, how much closer am I getting to this idea of lower tax accounts versus the idea of just IRA and 401k accounts? I think that's going to become more of an issue as you get within 5 years. To that degree, there is some things you might do, and I'm not going to suggest this is the answer for everyone, but there are occasions where I will say to people, maybe it does make sense for you to even cut back on your 401k contribution and just put that money after tax into something else. Because when you get that close to retirement, whatever you put in your 401k, if you have to pull it out in a couple years anyways to spend, you don't have enough time to really grow it anyways. So to some degree, it becomes a function of what are you trying to accomplish. So to that extent, as you get closer, this is the key question you want to start asking yourself. The second thing you want to start doing is start reviewing it with a little more detail. You need to start thinking about the income goal. And to that point, the spending idea of 10 years out was, well, about how much do I want to spend a month? Now it's a little closer to, we better start narrowing that down a little bit so that we can actually run numbers and see if you're there. And because if you're not there, then what does that mean? It could mean that you got to work a little longer. It could mean that you have to do a reverse mortgage or sell your house, after the age of 80. It could mean there's all kinds of things it could mean, but starting to get your arms around what that could mean is really a crucial point to make at this point. As I mentioned, adjust contributions or the retirement age, that could be an issue. We need to start thinking about market downturns a little bit. This isn't about just reducing risk and like cutting back on equities. This can be something a little broader than that. So we need to start stress testing for market downturns. And I'm not going to get into much more than that, but that's one of the points I want to bring up. And then what are the other long-term strategies we should be thinking about? We really want to start driving things that can lead to tax opportunities longer term. And the reason for that is because in your last 5 years of work, you're probably in your highest earning years. So there are certain strategies that might make more sense while you're still working, charity being one of them. If you retire and you suddenly take your income down dramatically, giving to charity has less of an impact. I'd rather give away money in the 35% tax bracket than in the 12% tax bracket. So to that extent, we might start thinking about how do we load up charitable giving strategies in the last few years of work in comparison to waiting too long. And then if we do that, by the way, and we get those deductions, what else should we be thinking about? So there could be some offsetting, interesting ideas that we throw out too. I'm not going to get into that today, but that's something to consider. 5 years out, you want to start thinking about where are the coverage gaps. And what I would also point out in this is that we want to start thinking about how you're going to deal with it if you got to go on Cobra or some kind of extension between work and actual Medicare, because that seems to stress people out a lot. But there are ways to cover that are somewhat, I'm not going to say easy because the healthcare system's never easy, but there are ways to deal with that. The thing you want to really start thinking about is what do you think healthcare costs are going to run? And everyone kind of guesses on this. So if you're still on Cobra, and or any plan where you got a family plan, let's say you have a few children, you will spend still going into retirement prior to Medicare, probably 24 to 40,000 a year. It's not an inexpensive answer. But from that standpoint, that's about where you're going to be. However, as soon as you jump on Medicare, that's going to actually slow down. Now, if you're still insuring kids, that's one issue. But let's say it's just you and a spouse jumping on Medicare, all of a sudden that might drop to $1,000 a month, and instead of 2, 3, 4,000 a month. So I bring that up because everyone thinks Medicare is the most expensive answer, and the reality is it's actually not. Second thing I want to point out is the HSA. I brought this idea up already, but this is the time to really focus in on how do I maximize this. This isn't about putting just a few thousand in. This is about maximizing it and not pulling it out. So keep that in mind as you are 5 years out. And then 5 years out, you want to start thinking about your long-term care plan if you haven't already. This really comes back down to, do you want to insure or not insure? And when I say not insure, I'm not saying not insure. What I'm saying is you're self-insuring, because if you're going to buy insurance, the best time to do it is in your 50s. As you get into your 60s, especially as you get close to 65, long-term care insurance gets very expensive. And so for a lot of people, they just at that point say no because they just look at the cost and say it's not worth it. But long-term care insurance is really a health decision and therefore a comfort decision. If you're going to do it in your 50s. So usually, like I say, 5 years out, let's start talking about it and seeing if it makes sense. If you're going to self-insure, that's fine. We can have that conversation. There are no real answers to this, but typically if you have more than $5 million, self-insurance makes sense. If you have 2 to 5 million, it starts, it's a maybe. It's like, yeah, it could work. If you have history of, Alzheimer's and dementia in the family, things like that. If you're under 1 or 2 million, then it becomes a question of what are you trying to do? Does it make sense from a cost perspective? Those are the questions that come up. But now's the time to think about it. If you put it to bed today and say we're not going to do it, my bet is you'll never do it, because it is going to get more expensive from this point forward. The other thing to consider as you're 5 years out is what are you going to do with the house? This is a key question because I think too many people go into retirement not thinking about the house as an asset. Now, like I said earlier, sometimes the house is a dead asset. But what I've seen most people do in retirement is thinking that the house is a forever decision. And then they start changing their mind dramatically as their kids move around, grandkids move around. We've seen more and more people that move to Florida actually move back to Minnesota. They don't worry about the tax hit there. They just say, I want to be near my grandkids. And so the house becomes a more fungible asset. And we're starting to see more and more people actually selling their homes and renting. That's a new phenomenon. That was something, of course, 20, 30 years ago, no one wanted to be the renter. And today it's kind of like, well, why not? Why not get rid of the maintenance and the added costs of taxes and all the things that come along with the house ownership? So there is some new movement in that direction. And what I would also point out for people that are interested, some of these retirement communities nowadays that you can go into are more like five-star resorts. And for people that want to, going in while you're younger and more mentally acute probably makes more sense because you'll make more relationships. When you go in later in life, when you're probably not as mentally there, um, and or physically unable to walk the hallways and meet people, it's actually a harder experience. And so I am more and more for people doing this earlier in life, not later. Early is relative. You don't have to do it when you're 55, but if you're going to move into one of these facilities when you want to do it when you're 70, do it when you're 70. You don't have to wait till you're 85 and really down and out. So that is something to consider as you get into this. Finally, 5 years out, you want to really zone in on your estate plan. And what I'll tell you is on the estate plan, once you zone in on it, you're going to want to review it every 3 to 5 years. So this isn't a one and done strategy, but the estate plan has to start coordinating with all the other things you're doing. Because most likely, for a lot of people on this call, you'll be setting up trusts, and you're going to need to make sure that as you do that, things get retitled, beneficiaries get redone, all the stuff that has to happen when you do trust, planning and estates planning. And as you do that, those kinds of things take time and effort. And what I've seen is when people do that, like when they're like a year out from retirement and they're scrambling to do that stuff while at the same time trying to close up work, trying to say goodbye to people, whatever, it becomes a lot of pain. So get the hard part done 5 years out, and then the review every 3 to 5 years can be rather simple. Um, but it does make sense to start thinking about it. And what I'd point out is number four. Too many people go into estate planning with the idea that I got to give everything to my kids. If I could help charities a little bit, maybe I could do that. But here's something to consider as you get into estate planning. If you're at all intent on helping charities, now's the time to start thinking about, do I want to do that using my 401k or IRA assets? Because when your kids inherit that stuff, they actually have a little bit different problem. When you pass away and your spouse inherits it, your spouse can still take money out over their life expectancy. But when your kids inherit it, they have to take it out within 10 years of your death. And so that typically jacks up their tax bracket. And if you think about that, that means if more money is going to taxes, less money goes to them. Well, if you're going to pay more money out in taxes, why not just instead give some of that to charity? Too many people go into estate plans saying, well, I don't want to put charity in the estate plan, but I want to give to charity. I'm not sure how. That could be a good way to use assets that are already going to be taxed a little uglier at death. So I'm going to suggest that you can have that conversation though as you move forward. So 5 years out, this is where we start to target the tax planning a little tighter, to make sure we understand where things are happening. We're also going to target, and I didn't get into this too much, when and if you get close to retirement and you start seeing a drop in income, we should be thinking about Roth conversions or other strategies as taxable income comes down. We might be able to squeeze things into certain tax brackets. We want to make sure the estate plan gets done, and we want to make sure that there's a charitable giving strategy that's starting to be thought through. Because if it's something where we want to give money now while you're in a higher tax bracket, we want to do that. And or if there's something we want to put into your estate plan, we want to do that. I'll point out, by the way, on that charitable giving, too many people don't think about this, but if you've got stock options that you need to deal with. That could be an interesting idea around charitable giving too. Or if you're selling a business or piece of real estate or something, you can actually do some really cool charitable giving strategies with those assets too, but you have to do it in advance of the sale. So those are things to consider as you start digging into this. All right, let's look 1 year out. Here's where the rubber meets the road. Basically, I mentioned this already. You want to maintain equity exposure. You do not want to cut back on your risk. Okay. So from that perspective, revisiting the portfolio comes into a different perspective. You want to actually focus in on the first 12 months. So what we want to do is we want to look at your spending plan. Let's say you want to spend 10,000 a month, 120,000 a year. We want to put the first 12 months in your portfolio in cash because that's what you're going to need. And if you sit on 12 months worth of cash at all times, then the ability to ignore the markets when they're down is actually greater. So from here on out, we start to move into a little different mindset in the portfolio. And we let the 12-month cash number float. So 12 months can drop down to as low as 6 months. So as you spend it up month after month, we'll let it float down to 6, but then we'll sell something to replenish it. If it gets higher than 12 months, and for each client, this is a little different, but sometimes we let it run as high as 150% higher. So maybe as high as $160,000 is in there. Then we start to reinvest a little bit. But that's the general idea of it. The biggest thing that we start to talk to people about when we're this close to retirement is the behavioral issues around investing, because behavior is going to get in the way more often than not. It's when people start to look at it from the standpoint of they can't earn a paycheck, they start to feel like a loss of control. And all of a sudden, the market feels like it's just at a whim. And so they're like, well, the markets are going to drop. I got to sell. But that's actually the worst advice. Everyone agrees it's the worst advice until they actually are in the moment where they can't bring new money in the door and then they start to panic. So I bring it up because everyone needs to go in realizing the behavioral side of investing becomes extremely important at this phase. And for the first few years of retirement, to be quite honest, that's what we deal with mostly with a lot of the investment piece for people. And then it seems like after that, when people get through it after a few years and realize, oh no, this works pretty well, everything kind of mellows out, then it's less of an issue. When you're within a year, you want to start thinking about your pensions. You want to start thinking about any survivorship decisions that you got to deal with. So this becomes a numbers running game. You're going to probably start to decide exactly what you're doing with Social Security at this point. Now that could change because if you go back to what Social Security is, it becomes a health decision. If you're healthy and we say, great, let's delay Social Security, we got some cool distribution strategies we can do in your portfolio, that'd be good. But if all of a sudden your health changes and you get cancer and it's like, wait, I don't know how long I'm going to live, we may say, start Social Security right away. So the point here is that whatever decision you make today isn't the last decision, but the decision you make today probably carries you through retirement in the first few years. So just to bring that up. So as we shore up cash reserves, it's all about protecting against market swings so that we can behaviorally be ready for what comes next. So when you're a year out, it's this income strategy idea that we focus in on. We start to focus in on making decisions around pensions, Social Security. We really are going to focus in on taxes and what the tax impact is as we move forward. So as you look through all of this stuff, those are the kind of the main themes when you're a year out. And then all of a sudden the magic date happens and you're there. What ends up happening on your first year is we need to look at spending. But what I'm going to tell you right now is that as we go into retirement, you're going to be 100% wrong on what you're spending for the first few years. And that's okay. I think of this as retirement's 30 years long. if we're off for 1 or 2 years, it doesn't matter really when you look at how the numbers run. I'd rather hit the broadside of a barn than the bullseye. So going in, know that you don't know everything yet. The one-time expenses you're not always aware of. Secondly, you're the healthiest at this point. So you're going to want to spend money. And I think that's one thing I want to point out. As we get into this, the early years are where you're going to spend more money. And so freedom of spending is a key issue. When people call me and say, I'm going to retire in the next year or two, what does my spending need to be? My answer is very different than many. It isn't let's figure that out. It's what do you want to spend? Because here's what I've learned. We can run numbers to back up that answer. And we can make sure from that number standpoint, you understand if you're overspending and what that implication is so that you'll have to make a decision 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later about something different. But the opposite is also true. There's just as much of a chance you get sick within 2 years of retiring, and then you can't ever enjoy it. And so from what I've seen over my career is I'd rather have people go into retirement and think about spending from the perspective of the freedom it gives them to enjoy what they can while they're healthy. And then let's work backwards on the numbers to figure that part out. Half the time, if you're really tight on numbers, it could mean, okay, when you're 80, you got to sell your house or do a reverse mortgage, or it could mean can't hang on to a cabin for the rest of your life. Maybe two houses just isn't in the cards. But for a lot of people, it actually works out. So I bring that up as one aspect. The second aspect I want to bring up is another concern that comes up a lot is, are we creating enough income off the portfolio? The idea of income off of a portfolio is an old idea. Been around forever. I can't argue that that's not worked at times, but when interest rates were zero for 15 years prior to COVID, the idea kind of died because when interest rates are zero, you can't earn any income on a portfolio. And so we got more into this idea of a total portfolio return. What came out of that idea, though, was basically the total portfolio return idea actually is more beneficial because what we do is we focus on pulling money you need for spending out of the right spots at the lowest tax answer. And so we end up with a hopefully lower tax bill than if we just have a portfolio that's generating high income, because high income just goes on your tax return and pushes you into higher brackets probably. It's a little different concept, but I bring it up because we do see people as they get into this and they start thinking about their budget. I want to spend so much a month. Oh no, my portfolio won't give me that. So now I got to cut. And the answer is no, you don't need to cut. The answer is we just adjust the portfolio to do what you want to do, but we're going to do it in a way that gives you the best tax answer too. So please, 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 if I can impart anything on you on this point of spending, just don't listen to the people that say that you have to worry about the income side, because that is workable around with other ideas in the portfolio. Now, as we talk about this going forward after year one and going forward, what ends up happening is we need to be thinking about the distribution and tax strategy annually. So this idea of meeting with your advisor annually is a big deal. You should be having proactive meetings every year. Your advisor should be reviewing last year's strategy against what happened on the actual tax return, and then creating a pro forma for the next year's strategy. And that should be something you discuss every year. You should have a synopsis of that. At all times, you kind of got to know what's going on. And that comes into play a lot because we are constantly rethinking how to take income or not take income, what kind of deductions we're after. Some of that stuff you can actually drive. So I bring that up as a big deal. And then the middle one, I've mentioned this already. The biggest mistake people make as they get into retirement is this loss of control not forces, causes them to panic when markets swing and they think they have to take action. Please, please, please don't take action. The biggest thing you can do when markets swing is just go and have a cup of coffee. It's that simple. Just let those things happen, let them play out, and you'll be in a better spot. I've seen the opposite. I've seen plenty of people that have made the mistake and they have so much less money in retirement because of it. But, anyways, as I move forward, we're getting towards the end. So if you do have questions, please drop them in. The this last couple of things I want to point out is that retirement is about moving forward, not looking to the past. So it's not about looking back and saying, oh, I was a big shot at work and now I'm not. It's actually about a transition from I used to be good at this and now I'm really good at that. That could be I'm good at volunteering. I'm good at consulting. I'm good at other relationships that I let slide. I'm good at golfing with my high school buddies. There could be other things, but what I point out is that joy in retirement comes from relationships. It doesn't come from just doing stuff on your own, like hanging out at home watching TV. We see TV usage in retirement skyrocket, by the way. The stats are interesting. And that's a poor display of what actually should be happening because those people are locked up. So going into retirement, the idea is that you want to maintain at least 150 relationships, and the 150 don't have to be your best friends. You know, 30 of them can be the barista at Starbucks that sees you every day, or the waiter at Perkins that sees you once a week. That's fine. You're going to have 2 or 3 really good ones right in the bullseye. You're going to have 5 or 6 outside of that. You're going to have 10 outside of that. And as you go bigger, it just changes. But in general, true happiness, if you look at the studies, is that when you maintain about 150 relationships in your sphere. And I bring it up because so many people in retirement that are miserable because they don't get out, keep meeting people, keep developing, keep being inquisitive, keep learning. Those are really key ideas that I think need to happen. So as we get into the end, we're going to keep reviewing for healthcare and other surprises that come up. But in general, what I point out is that going into that retirement that year, the biggest thing I notice is people worry too much about spending and they spend too little. I worry that people aren't enjoying their money enough. I worry that people are not, if they want to, of course, helping their kids enough, helping their grandkids enough. I've said this in past webinars. Your kids and your grandkids need help when they're 25 to age 40. They don't need to inherit all your money when they're 60. By then, they've figured life out. So doing more while you're early in retirement and want to be around to see the joy that brings, I think is the key message here. If I can impart anything on you, that's the way to start thinking about it. As I end, I do have a question that came in. I'll let you take a look at this slide. The question is, with the charitable deduction changes in the recent tax bill, do you have any new recommendations for tax savings while contributing to charity? Interesting question. For those of you that don't know, I'm going to assume this is what you're referring to. Starting next year, there is a shift in that basically the first 0.5% of your adjusted gross income that you give to charity does not count. So in essence, they're putting a floor on what's deductible. If you think about that, 0.5% of $100,000 is $500. So if you earned $100,000 and you gave $500 to charity, not deductible. If you gave $1,200 to charity, 500 is not deductible, 700 is. So to that point, maybe that's not a big deal. Like if you make $200,000 and you can't deduct $1,000, maybe it's not a big deal. But I think there's two things here. One is, to that point, make more charitable deductions this year, most likely, right? I mean, why not? Why not make sure you get full deduction out of it? So that could mean you push something into 2025 that you didn't want to do in 2026. If you're using things like donor advised funds and stuff, that's easy to do. Second point I'd make, though, is I always get nervous when those kinds of things come into the tax law, because what it means is in future years, they can expand it without really having to explain that they increased your taxes. Because if you think about it, they can always say, well, we never raised tax rates. But what they do is they meddle with little things like how much they're allowing you to deduct. And in essence, they raised your taxes. So I do think this is a disturbing idea because they're hurting charities, but in the long run, they could be expanding how much they hurt charities. So I do not like it, but that is the point we are going to live with now. So goes back to my first point. If you've got large charitable contribution thoughts, you should do them this year. But I would even point out with something like a donor advice fund, let's say you gave $5,000 a year to your church. You might look at this and say, well, I'm going to just look at the next 5 years and I'm going to lump some 25,000 into a donor advised fund in 2025 yet. You can still give $5,000 each year to your church. You don't have to give it to them all at once, but at least you got full deduction. So, and I'll go back. When I say full deduction, it's still predicated on the fact that you can deduct it all. I don't know your itemized deductions and stuff. So that is part of it. But I assume that's what you're talking about. If I haven't hit that one on the head, feel free to reach out to me by email afterwards, and I can answer it. With that, I am going to, in our next session next month, get into the big beautiful bill and how it affects you. There are other people here at BGM that are doing some webinars on the big beautiful bill that are based more on corporate tax or business tax issues. This will focus specifically on individual tax issues. So as you are thinking about retirement and other things, that's the kind of stuff I'll be digging into. So I hope you can join us next time. I don't see any more questions. So with that, I want to thank all of you for attending. I really appreciate it. And if you feel like reaching out, feel free to reach out, and I'll be glad to get back to you quickly. Have yourself a fantastic weekend. Bye-bye.